Okay, so when we look at chapter 2 on page 48, towards the bottom of the page, Sandel writes, recently, economists have set themselves a more ambitious project. What economics offers, and here he's talking about market economists, advocates of markets. What economics offers, they argue, is not merely a set of insights about the production and consumption of material goods, but also a science of human behavior. At the heart of this science is a simple but sweeping idea. In all domains of life, human behavior can be explained by assuming that people decide what to do by weighing the costs and benefits of the options before them, and choosing the one they believe will give them the greatest welfare or utility. Okay, and that's what the market-based system is trying to capitalize on for the sake of efficiency gains. The market-based system says, look, the way people navigate life is they weigh the costs and benefits of the options before them, and they choose the one they believe will give them the greatest welfare or utility. Sandel goes on to write, if this idea is right, then everything has its price. The price may be explicit, as with cars and toasters, or it may be implicit, as with sex, marriage, children, education, criminal activity, racial discrimination, political participation, environmental protection, even human life. Whether or not we're aware of it, the law of supply and demand governs the provision of all of these things. Okay, so what Sandel is saying here is that everything is approached by human beings in life, at least according to market economists, in terms of their personal utility and how they perceive things to be of value to them. And that includes things that are not, strictly speaking, economic. Sex, marriage, children, education, criminal activity, political participation, etc. Let's look at the first example on page 51. This is an example from a very different area of life than what we've been talking about. It's an example of trying to use markets to promote greater efficiency and also to incentivize good behavior, but arguably at the cost of corrupting the goods that it touches. Okay, so I'll go ahead and list the strength that I'll try to draw out of the example. Promotes good behavior. Earlier we talked about how the decentralized market-based system of resource distribution incentivizes people to try to be creative or to try to be more efficient in their actions. Okay, and certainly creativity, efficiency, it also incentivizes hard work. We could add that to it. Okay, since you're on your own, nobody's going to help you out. No central authority will provide you with resources by virtue of you just being a citizen of the society. Okay, all of those things are good behaviors. So arguably markets promote good behavior. Let's use the example here on page 51. Okay, here's an example. Sandel writes, school districts across the United States now try to improve academic performance by paying children for getting good grades or high scores on standardized tests. The idea that cash incentives can cure what ails our schools looms large in the movement for educational reform. Let me ask you guys, if your parents were paying you $3,000 for every A you received this semester, would you be more incentivized to work hard to get good grades? I sure would be. I think most of us would be. Why? What's that, Turka? There's a reward, and it's very tangible, it's immediate, it's accessible, you know what the reward is going to be. What if I told you that you are actually being paid for good grades? In the form of the compensation that you will be receiving at the job that you get after college. But it feels far off, doesn't it? It's not like immediate, and it feels kind of nebulous and intangible, so it's hard to be as motivated when it's, not the immediate cash payment. Okay, and Sandel says there actually have been mixed results from some of these efforts to pay school kids for good grades. For instance, here on page 52, he says in New York City, participating schools paid fourth graders $25 to score well on standardized tests. In Washington, D.C., schools paid middle school students cash rewards for attendance, good behavior, and turning in their homework. In Chicago, they offered ninth graders cash for getting good grades in their courses. And in Dallas, they pay second graders $2 for each book they read. The cash payments, though, have yielded mixed results. In New York City, paying kids for good test scores did nothing to improve their academic performance. The cash for good grades in Chicago led to better attendance, but no improvement on standardized tests. In Washington, the payments helped some students achieve higher reading scores. The cash worked best with the Dallas second graders. The kids who got paid $2 per book wound up with higher reading comprehension scores at the end of the year. Those capitalist Texans motivated by money. Okay, now, if paying for good grades works, and in some cases it appears to work, although the results are kind of mixed. If paying for good grades works, then arguably using market norms can bring about better behaviors in people than would otherwise be the case. But think with me for just a minute about the psychology here. Suppose your parents did pay you $3,000 for every A. Would there be any of us who would still be motivated at that point to work hard in our classes for the sake of the learning? For the sake of the education itself? My own motivation for that side of things would be diminished by virtue of the cash payment. The cash payment would color my perception of things. It would make me more interested in doing things for the sake of the money. And if the cash payment were to be withdrawn, if my parents stopped the payments, I would probably become highly de-incentivized to work hard. If what I'm describing is true of us more generally, it suggests that when money touches things, it tends to take control of our motives. And when money is used to promote good behavior, it tends to become the object of human beings' motivation, so that human beings are incentivized to work for the sake of the money and not for the sake of the activity itself. Now, I know that actually the grading system itself has problems doing that. I'm actually not necessarily a fan of grades. I think when you have grades in the picture, the students aren't actually trying to learn, they're trying to study for the sake of the grade. You study hard for the test and then you forget it all because you were just studying for the grade, not for actually absorbing the information and becoming a more educated person. So I think that the grading system itself has problems. But when money is involved, it doubles those problems. A second example that Sandel cites then, so we've looked at cash for grades. Second example that Sandel cites of using money to promote good behavior is what he calls health bribes. Health bribes. Okay, he writes on page 55, healthcare is another area where cash incentives are in vogue. Increasingly, doctors, insurance companies, and employers are paying people to be healthy, to take their meds, to quit smoking, to lose weight. You might think that avoiding disease or life-threatening ailments would be motivation enough, but surprisingly, that's often not the case. 1/3 to 1/2 of patients fail to take their medications as prescribed. When their conditions worsen, the overall result is billions of dollars a year in additional health costs. So doctors and insurers are offering cash incentives to motivate patients to take their meds. Interesting, really fascinating. I would probably be more incentivized to take my meds if I had cash payments on the line. I would probably also be more incentivized to eat healthy if I had cash payments on the line. So if there's a, what's my kryptonite? Mint Oreo out on the counter, okay, which I cannot resist. And alongside it is an apple. And I can choose, let's say, 2 or 3 Mint Oreos versus an apple. And let's say $20 is on the line. And if choosing the apple nets me $20, I'll choose the apple. But if it doesn't, odds are I'll probably choose the Oreos. Oreos against apples. It has to be a really virtuous day for Dr. Neal to choose apples over Oreos. Those happen rarely. Okay. So maybe it could incentivize me to eat healthy. Maybe it could incentivize me to take my pills. But in doing so, it probably would also cause me to become motivated by the prospect of the payment rather than by the prospect of the health. Now, I know it could also be argued in the case of health that I am being paid for eating the apple because the health costs that come with a lifetime of junky eating are substantial. They shorten your life, right? They increase your medical bills. That's less time with family and friends, less time to see my grandchildren, all that. Okay, odds are that I'm actually being paid for eating the apple. But again, it's nebulous, it's far off, it's hard to conceptualize. Okay, on page 57, Sandel writes, 2 questions can be asked about paying people for healthy behavior. Does it work, and is it objectionable? From an economic point of view, the case for paying people for good health is a simple matter of costs and benefits. The only real question is whether incentive schemes work. If money motivates people to take their meds, quit smoking, or join a gym, thus reducing the need for expensive care later, why object? Sandel goes on to write, and yet many do object to using money to promote health. The use of cash incentives to promote healthy behavior, in fact, generates fierce moral controversy. One objection is about fairness. The other is about bribery. Okay, I'll briefly mention those 2 objections. It could be argued that it is unfair to some people to pay people for good health or for healthy choices. Take quitting smoking as an example. It's unfair to all the employees at the company who aren't already smoking when the company starts paying some of the employees to quit smoking. So the objection to paying people for good health is that it's unfair to those other people who are already making choices for the sake of good health for their own sake and not for the sake of cash incentives. The other objection is about bribery. Okay, now earlier in the semester we did talk about bribery, and I can't remember, guys, if I did the bribery lecture in the Monday section or the Wednesday section of this class. Regardless, we should have seen the videos, right? So what are the 2 main problems with bribery that I highlighted in the class lecture on bribery? Do you guys remember? This is a long time ago. Yeah, Rachel. You gotta shout, girl, you're in a mask. Okay? Good. Yes, absolutely. One of the objections to bribery was it leads to impoverishment. Okay? That's absolutely right. Where there is great bribery, there you will find impoverished people. Okay, because bribery undermines efficiency in the society. Bribery locates money just in the hands of the wealthy. It doesn't disperse it among all the participants in the society, etc., etc. The other objection to bribery is that it actually is unfair and corrupts the process by means of which resources ought to be allocated. Okay, part and parcel of the corruption of bribery is that it damages the character states of the people giving and receiving the bribes. Okay, if you look on page 61, Sandel talks about the perversity of the incentives that can happen in these cases, in these such circumstances. He says here, it may turn out, as economic reasoning suggests, that 2 incentives work better than one, that is, health for its own sake or health for the sake of making money. But it could also turn out that the monetary incentive undermines the intrinsic one, leading to less of the good behavior rather than more, or to more of the good behavior in the short run, but for the wrong reason. Okay, in this scenario, the market is an instrument, but not an innocent one. What begins as a market mechanism becomes a market norm. The obvious worry is that payments may habituate people into thinking of health or reading books or getting good grades or whatever as a way of making money, And in this way, it might erode or crowd out or corrupt the love of the activity for its own sake. Okay, and that's what I was trying to articulate a little bit earlier. A little bit later on in the discussion of incentives, he talks about some of the other objections to markets that we've voiced so far. So for instance, here on page 62, he canvasses a proposal for using market norms to reform the immigration process in the United States. Immigration's a total mess in the United States right now. A bunch of people want to get into this country. Citizenship in the United States is a pretty valuable thing to have in the world. And way more people want to get in than are able to get in. And so it's been proposed, well, why don't we actually try to introduce efficiency norms into this process? Cut through all the Byzantine red tape of the immigration process, introduce efficiency norms, and offer immigration to those who are willing to pay. Okay, and if you are able and willing, you can buy your way into citizenship is the proposal here. Let me just read what Sandel writes about this. In fact, actually, there is a process by means of which this can happen. He says the idea of selling the right to immigrate was offensive to some, but in an age of rising market faith, the proposal soon found its way into law, and in 1990 in the United States, Congress provided that foreigners who invested $500,000 in the United States could immigrate with their families for 2 years, after which they could receive a permanent green card if the investment created at least 10 jobs. The cash for green card plan was the ultimate queue jumping scheme, a fast track to citizenship. Okay, I think that's fascinating, and I think it's also very disturbing. I think it's fascinating that we actually do have in the United States now provisions for persons to buy their way into citizenship if their monetary payments create enough jobs for existing American citizens. I think it's deeply disturbing, though, that some can buy their way in while others can't. So we talked earlier about markets. One weakness of markets is that they discriminate against the poor. If a system like immigration were to be exposed to market norms, it would end up being a system where the wealthy could benefit and the impoverished would not benefit. In fact, in almost all cases where markets operate, they tend to lead to very unequitable wealth distributions, and it takes some sort of non-market mechanism, like a government regulator or a central authority, to intervene to bring about greater equity. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing. I happen to think it's a good thing to have a bit of greater equity in the society. But it is something that is interesting and that Sandel talks about in treating this immigration case. Okay, there's a second main point, and I don't have much time to cover it. We'll have to cover a lot of this main point, the second main point, next week when we are going over the Sandel text in a little bit greater detail. It's this point that he wants to make on page 65 about fines and fees. Okay, who's been stopped for a speeding ticket and had to pay a speeding ticket before in class? Several of us? Okay, how much? 160 something? Okay, how much? I'm sorry? How fast were you going? Okay, 350, all right. Okay, I have yet to be stopped for a speeding ticket. Although actually, young women 25 and under are the best demographic to be if you want to get away with speeding. So the stats suggest that women 25 and under get warnings at a much higher rate than the general population. And the general population, would get slapped with a speeding ticket, whereas that privileged demographic might not. Okay, but anyway, when you guys paid speeding tickets, it was a fine, right? Did you feel shame? Did you feel remorse? Felt that you needed to reform your ways? The point of a fine is to create a sense of moral stigma, right? To make you feel as though you've done something wrong, to make you feel ashamed and desirous of altering your behaviors. Okay, when I was a kid, they used to have such things as public libraries. I know the public libraries are rarely visited these days. But I love to go to the library and check out books. Okay, but I wasn't very good about returning books on time. And they would find me. And I just feel like morally so bad because I was so lazy about returning my books on time. I feel like really bad. And it wasn't a big fine. It was like $3 or $5 or something like that. But the fact that the fine had been levied against me just made me feel condemnation. Okay, now, fees, the word fee carries no such moral aspersion. Okay, a fee is simply something that you pay for the right to do something. Here's the fact of the matter. If you look at speeding tickets, they are often used by municipalities to boost local revenue sources. Because, taxes aren't necessarily enough to fund all the needs of local governments. So they'll use speeding tickets to make up the difference. Some municipalities, not in the United States but elsewhere, actually offer speeding packages. So what you can do is you can purchase at the beginning of the year, I suppose, each year, a right to speed this year. And it costs a certain amount of money, but if you really love, feel the need for speed, you can do it all year if you want. That's a fee, not a fine. And it feels really different, doesn't it? If you were to purchase a speeding package, you would no longer feel any sort of moral condemnation for speeding. Instead, it would feel as though you had purchased a privilege, which you now could indulge in all you wanted. Okay, and Sandel says, when markets are introduced into social coordination problems like, highway speeding or something like that, what ends up happening is an important part of the non-market mechanisms that had been in place, fines, becomes lost by virtue of the markets stripping away the moral stigma of the wrong deed. Okay, 350 is actually nothing. I talked to a guy one time, one of my students. He was telling me that he's a football player. He had a truck. He was telling me that he got a $650 ticket. I didn't ask him how fast he was going, but yeah, must have been going really fast. Probably at a school zone. Who knows? Okay. When markets are involved, it tends to become all about the money, and it's no longer about other things like moral aspersion or any sort of shame that the activity has. So maybe markets can be used to incentivize good behavior. Okay, but when they are used to incentivize good behavior, or in certain cases like speeding, to permit wrongful behavior while at the same time increasing the coffers of the state, they may do things like bring buyers and sellers together in a more efficient way, but they do so at the expense of important non-market norms, which they destroy or strip away. Norms that can't seem to flourish or exist in an environment where money is a main consideration. Okay, but I got to stop the lecture right there. We're at time, so we're going to have to explore the fines and fees issue a little bit greater length next week.